And thank you so much to Body Dynamics and Gwen for inviting me here today to be able to talk to you all about our new practice and sort of a unique area of clinical focus, which is sports endocrinology. So just a little bit about me. I am an OBGYN reproductive endocrinologist, and I have done a lot of years of clinical and research in the past. And now recently have started Pellex Sports and Pellex Fertility and Menopause to improve access to reproductive endocrine care, because most endocrinologists, reproductive endocrinologists, focus more on infertility treatments. And we are an online telemedicine practice, exclusively virtual, but we can order the same blood work and imaging, sending you to a local Quest or radiology facility, and also prescribe medications that can be shipped to your door. So sometimes it's a little confusing about what it is we do, but that's in a nutshell. So sports medicine endocrinology. So what is it? If we start first with endocrinology, that's the one most people are familiar with. It's the study of endocrine glands and hormones in the human body. And then what we focus on specifically in reproductive endocrinology is the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. And this is a really beautiful system that provides a lot of checks and balances to regulate the menstrual cycle, the ovary, pregnancy, reproductive hormones, and all reproductive functions. And it's important, particularly in female athletes, because a hormonal assessment can give us an idea about the reproductive system in the female athlete and can help give us a window into whether there's a good balance of energy levels in that specific athlete. And so this is a diagram showing this hypothalamus, which is in the brain, and the pituitary, which is also in the brain, but downstream, the hypothalamus secretes something called gonadotropin releasing hormones onto the anterior pituitary, which then secretes the hormones that stimulate the ovaries, FSH and LH. And then the ovaries can make estrogen and progesterone, and these can have both negative and positive feedbacks both at these levels. And what we really focus on at Pellex Sports is something called relative energy deficiency in sports. And this is when your energy deficiency or balance is off if there's a deficiency. So if you're expending more energy than you're taking in by eating, then you can, it leads to this energy imbalance. And this imbalance can cause many problems throughout the body and even outside of the endocrine system. It basically is a form of your body shutting down and trying to preserve basic functions. And your body feels like it is in somewhat of a starvation mode and just trying to survive. So it has a lot of effects on even sleep and cognition, etc. So some of you may be familiar with the term triad, and relative energy deficiency in sports is the new, more broad definition that's preferred, and it was previously known more narrowly as the female athlete triad. And this consists of low energy availability, and that's usually because of decreased caloric intake and increased energy expenditure. And it's characterized by menstrual disturbances, so a late onset of the first period, or the loss of your menstrual periods, or they become irregular. And it's also associated with low bone mineral density, which can lead to stress fractures clinically, and or evidence on imaging DEXA scan of osteopenia or osteoporosis or low bone density. And one of the really important components of relative energy deficiency in sports, or REDS, is nutrition. And it's a little bit confusing because it's a lot about eating enough, but it's very different than just a straightforward eating disorder that maybe some of us are more familiar with, such as anorexia or bulimia. And it kind of can you can hint at an issue with the nutrition side of REDS if there is a preoccupation with dieting or with their weight, an athlete's weight, if they're picky about what they eat or increasing pickiness, if they skip meals or they try and restrict certain aspects of their diet when it's not medically indicated or necessary. And this restricted caloric intake not only contributes to the energy imbalance of REDS, but also deprives the body of essential nutrients if you're not getting enough intake. What's important in that is those calories are not just the calories, but also the nutrients. And as an example, an athlete should include about 1,500 milligrams per day of calcium through diet specifically, because it's not easily absorbed with supplementation, and 15 to 2,000 international units per day of vitamin D to make sure that you don't have vitamin D deficiency, which is currently an endemic problem in our country. So what does healthy nutrition mean for an athlete? And the unique thing about athletes is that it's really depends on where they are in their training or competition. So people and experts and medical caregivers that are fluent in the different special and unique needs of female athletes are important to be able to give specific advice that doesn't actually make the nutrition side worse. So for instance, if you categorize what the athletes should ideally be eating in proportion of veggies, carbs, and proteins, it depends on if they're having an easy or recovery day, if it's a moderate day, or if it's a competition day, two-a-days, preseason, something like that. And for example, here on an easy day, you want to balance carbs and proteins and have those two balanced with fruits and veggies. But on a moderate training day, you want to increase carbs and proteins. And then during your competitive days, it's important to fuel your body for optimal performance with half carbs. A related disorder, this is sort of the language more that the reproductive endocrinologists use, is we would call this functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. And exercising or an energy deficiency is just one of the ways that you can have functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. That means basically something happened, either medically, clinically, that caused a patient to stop having their period. And when the body becomes stressed, then the hypothalamus doesn't secrete as much GnRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and then that means the anterior pituitary doesn't secrete as much FSH and LH, and then the ovary goes quiet and doesn't make estradiol like it should. But it's important to realize that this is also impacting multiple other endocrine systems that have big implications for health and performance. So another term that you may see is called exercise-induced amenorrhea. It's a relative caloric deficiency similar to REDS, energy imbalance, and it's inadequate nutritional intake for the amount of energy expended. And it starts that cascade that we just saw on the last slide with dysregulation of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And dysregulation of the hypothalamus, assuming that there's no organic disease like a mass or some other kind of severe illness, leads to the absence of normal ovarian follicular development and the absence of the mid-cycle of your menstrual cycle, the LH surge, which usually induces releasing of an egg. And this can lead to anovulation, meaning that no egg got released that month, and ultimately is associated with low serum estradiol. And this is really important because you need estrogen to maintain your bone density. So a consequence of this deficiency would be low bone density, anovulatory, infertility, also some mood changes and implications, and also adverse cardiovascular consequences. And a lot of times we get it gets really confusing with birth control, because birth control kind of clouds the picture in a few different ways. First, It is a synthetic and an estrogen and progesterone. So in some ways, you're giving the body estrogen and progesterone, but because we're artificially taking over this system, then you're going to have a period every month, but the hypothalamus could be completely shut down or off, and as well as the anterior pituitary, and then the body isn't making normal bioidentical or naturally occurring estrogen and progesterones, and they're only getting these synthetic estrogen and progesterones instead. And so when the hypothalamus is shut off, then all those other hormones are also affected, not just the menstrual period. And the fact that patients are getting a withdrawal bleed actually provides a false sign that the hormones are functioning appropriately. And ultimately, the natural types of estrogen, like estradiol, remain low, and the consequences of that remain the same, which are sustained or worsening fracture risk. So what does the estrogen do on the bone? So specifically, it promotes the activity of cells in the bone called osteoblasts. And these are the cells that help form bone. And estrogen also inhibits osteoclasts, which are the cells that weaken bone and cause bone resorption. And when the estrogen levels drop, the osteoblast cells are not able to effectively produce bone, and the osteoclasts are free to further weaken bone and decrease the density. So therefore, the low estrogen leads to weak bones, and these weak bones are at increased risk of fracture. And these typically present in healthy athletes as stress fractures. And a stress fracture, many of you probably are aware, is an overuse injury of the bone caused by repetitive stress, either from increased load or from increased repetition. And in relative energy deficiency in sports, the decreased caloric intake with the increased activity creates other causes for weakened bones. So the two together also are associated with inadequate nutrients that we mentioned before for bone metabolism, like vitamin D and calcium. And the low BMI is associated with lower bone mineral density as well. And the hormonal disruption further weakens the bone. And unfortunately, a history of a stress fracture is actually the most significant risk factor for recurrent fractures. So women and girls that get one stress fracture, particularly early on, are at high risk for having them repetitively. And unfortunately, repeat stress fractures can be sports career ending for competitive athletes. And here's just a couple of snapshots to give you an idea of the scope of the problem. Women with exercise-induced amenorrhea, especially those engaged in activities associated with the restricted eating habits, may have decreased bone density in spite of the bone building effects of the weight-bearing exercise. So in girls, 24% have menstrual irregularity in this triad, and 60% of adult women. So it's not just a teenage thing. It can be women who pick up marathon or new types of exercising in adulthood. And it's associated with disordered eating patterns in about 20% of high school students and 25% of college athletes. And in ballet dancers, there's recurrent stress fractures in up to 30% of those athletes, and also 32%. It's similar with the runners. So our process is that it's really important to do a very careful, thorough menstrual history, diet and exercise history, and orthopedic history, in addition to a general history when we evaluate patients. And then we want to, basically because we have such a specialized clinic, we're really doing a very broad endocrine hormone assessment of many different, checking on many different organ endocrine systems. And that's because we want to make sure that we're not missing another reason for why the bones are weak or subject to stress fracture. So we want to rule out any other underlying diseases that could be contributing. And then once that is done, we can also check MRI to evaluate stress fractures and their recovery, and also bone mineral density over time. And really the key to good REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, and recurrent stress fracture management is a multidisciplinary team approach. And we really ended up focusing on this and really creating a dedicated website and clinic, because we were getting so many athletes that were sort of bouncing around orthopedic clinics with their recurrent stress fractures, and there wasn't anyone to sort of quarterback their care. And really that's the most important thing, is to really hit this from a multimodal strategy. So we work on the decreasing the energy output to improve the balance. So either reduce exercise activity and kind of go into a rest and recovery mentality. And then we also want to optimize nutrition, and specifically with people who understand sports and athletes' needs, not just a middle-aged mom that is not doing a lot of exercise. So it's not just about increasing caloric intake, but understanding when and how and the differences that athletes need. And then also to make sure that they have all of their nutrients are adequate and replaced. And then we can look at different types of hormonal treatments depending on the status of the athlete. One of a common approach is to offer unopposed estrogen. So instead of birth control pills, which have both synthetic estrogen and synthetic progesterone, athletes, there are some data that suggest that it's better to not take any hormones, or it's better to take unopposed bioidentical estrogen. And either one of those are better than patients that are taking combined birth control pills. They do worse. And then once we get the bones starting to heal, or we get the estrogen levels up, then we can add back cyclic progesterone, which is important to protect the uterus, because you don't want to have month after month, year after year of only estrogen on board and no progesterone. And then an important part of all of this is to address the stress and the resiliency and the coping skills. So sports psychologists, athletes by definition are under competitive stress, but there's good stress and maybe not good stress. So we want to have them be seen by a professional who understands the competitive needs. And so how is it that, Pellic Sports or a sports medicine endocrinologist, how can we help? So first, we're a proponent of an annual reproductive checkup, and this is particularly important for athletes or any woman who is on birth control pill, because the menstrual period is a vital sign, and it's created artificially when you're on a birth control pill or a hormonal form of birth control, like a progesterone IUD, because these underlying hormones could be either too low or too high, and they have serious health implications. So if we do serial evaluations, like on day 3 of the menstrual cycle, or once a month, or every several months, once patients are stable, then we can try and prevent some of these injuries. And if they've already been diagnosed either with relative energy deficiency in sports or a stress fracture, then we can do the endocrine workup, and with that multimodal approach, reverse and improve the energy and hormonal imbalances. And our ultimate goal is not just to get a menstrual period back, but really to improve the health of these athletes, and not just health, but performance. If we optimize these systems, it helps athletes perform better. And then also to make sure that these bones that they have when they're 19, that they're going to be as healthy as possible when they're in their later years of life and can have a lot of more orthopedic issues. So Pellic Sports, again, we know that athletes have unique health needs, And our patients are female, they're athletes or over-exercisers. They often have irregular or lost periods with disordered eating, and often, unfortunately, come to us after they've already had a stress fracture or have low bone mineral density. And the way that we work is that patients would they schedule a telehealth appointment through our website or over the phone. We're very easy to reach. You're going to reach me or Catherine or Rosalind, and you can text with us, and we make it easy to get the appointments and get scheduled. And we also are fortunate to have an orthopedic physician assistant who has spent many years in the orthopedic world and understands the fracture side way better, can bring that to the table for Pellex Sports, Emily Scheit. And so she'll meet with patients and athletes to get labs and or the imaging that we need and collect any outside imaging that you have. And then once all your blood work is back, you schedule an appointment and can be seen by me to review those results and come up with a plan. And then often it takes, every month or two for a while until we get on the right track, and then we can measure hormones and kind of show patients and athletes that, look, your hormones, look how healthy they looked when you were resting from your recent stress fracture. And then when you went back to preseason, everything kind of took a dip in the wrong direction. So there's a huge educational component to this as well. And then eventually hoping that patients will avail themselves to our sports nutrition experts and sports psychology experts, as well as physical therapists like a BDUI who really understand athletes' needs. And here are some of the collaborators that I just mentioned that we work with and are really key to the success of athletes with this disorder. And just wanted to close with two case studies. So the high school state champion tennis player for 4 years of high school. She had her first period, which is known as menarche, when she was 15 years old, sort of like mom did, which is common. Your age of your first period often is similar to what your mother's was. And then when she first got her period, they were regular for about a year. But then throughout her senior year, she was dealing with the pandemic, worrying about what schools to go to and scholarships and more stress. And then also converted from not just being a vegetarian, but to increasing that restrictiveness to being a vegan. And then she did lose her menses, and kudos to her mom who noted this as a problem and got her in to see a pediatric gynecologist. But mom was really upset that this physician seemed to keep trying to imply that they had an eating disorder when mom correctly identified that BMI is in the normal range, and didn't understand why the gynecologist was suggesting a DEXA. And so we saw her for a second opinion. And when we checked some of the baseline labs, there were several things, but the most important pattern is one we would expect in this type of situation, with low FSH, low LH, and unfortunately, inappropriately low estradiol. So usually in the normal state, if estradiol is high, it's making these go low, or if these are high, then it's making estrogen go up. But when FSH and LH is low and estradiol is low, then these are inappropriately low. So we counseled her parents about REDS and endorsed the recommendation to get a DEXA scan. We discussed hormone therapy with bioidentical estrogen and cyclic progesterone, but the decision was made to go forward with the birth control pill instead. But unfortunately, 3 months later, when she started playing her basketball season, she got a hip fracture. Did finally get a DEXA and broadened the diet to include fish and eggs, and had to drop out of basketball season because of the fracture. And then her menses spontaneously resumed and has continued, which is very good. We're excited for her. A second example is an 18-year-old competitive cheerleader. And she got menarche at 13, and she had regular menstrual cycles for about 4 years, but she moved to live out of state to do an elite cheerleading program. And the coach there encouraged her to lose weight so that she could improve her tumbling and get new tricks and get them more easily and throw those tricks more easily. And she was convinced by that. So she started restricting her eating more. And then she also added running 5 miles every morning to her regimen. She had a normal weight. She was not underweight at all. But she lost 15 pounds and even then was still technically within the normal weight, which is common with athletes with a lot of muscle mass. But she did lose her period at that point and has sustained multiple stress fractures. Her most recent stress fracture was to the femoral neck. And when, again, she was forced to rest and recover from this, a physical therapist encouraged her to just eat freely and resume a normal diet. And her menses spontaneously returned within a month. And that's about the time that she started with us. And her endocrine workup, as she was beginning to recover, still revealed a pattern that was consistent with relative energy deficiency in sports. And then on repeat serial testing, that improved during her rest. We encouraged her to meet with our sports nutritionist and sports psychologist. And then she moved states again and joined 2 teams and coaching 3 more teams, and basically had a backslide of her hormones. But thankfully, we were able to identify that and talk to her and her mom about these associations with her activity level and her hormones that are precursors to a stress fracture. So this isn't always a quick fix, but at least we're able now to have a mechanism to help athletes monitor and detect changes before they get their next stress fracture. So we would love to see any and all athletes at any level at Pellex Sports, and feel free to call or text us or email us at any time. We offer a free 15-minute consultation. I can kind of give you a brief gestalt of what I think your situation is, and if it would be helpful for you, or if there's a better place that we could refer you to, if it's not a condition that would be best addressed through Pellex Sports, and have that be risk-free. But we're really excited to build this practice and help as many athletes and educate them about the importance of a healthy endocrine system and the menstrual period as it being not just something that you need to try and get, but also that if you're healthy, it'll improve your performance. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering all of your questions now. If you want to put any in the Q&A box, then we will go over as many as we can here.
Erin, thank you so much. I think now you all can understand why Body Dynamics is so excited and honored to have the opportunity to collaborate and partner with Pellex. While we're waiting to see if we have any other questions, I will share with you, Erin, we've already had somebody in the Q&A share what a wonderful presentation it was, and how much they appreciate the work that you're doing, that it's got some really broad applicability. And how happy they are to see this kind of work being done.
Oh, great.
I have a question for you, Erin. Would you recommend the initial evaluation workup and then the continued annual checkup in those female athletes, even if they aren't on birth control?
Yes. We had a patient the other day who's a bodybuilder and very in tune to her body, and noted repetitively that she has never lost her period despite, extraordinary lengths to go to decrease body fat and increase muscle mass and for competitions. And the interesting thing about this patient is that her hormone profile, in fact, was not ovulatory. And then even just happenstance, we diagnosed her with one of the most common bleeding disorders. So it could be that sometimes a menstrual period isn't because you're actually releasing an egg each month, and it could be due to any number of other factors. So I encourage all women to come in annually for a reproductive wellness check.
And Erin, how early do you recommend the screening athletes for the hormone issues?
I think as soon as, either when they're around getting their first period, or if that's a time when they're increasing their activity level, or you notice any kind of a change in their menstrual cycle. For instance, it used to be regular and then it became irregular. Those are all good times to check in. And we're not just screening. This reproductive wellness isn't just for sports management and bones. Some of the tests that we can do either on or off of birth control can diagnose other reproductive conditions that are underlying, such as polycystic ovarian syndrome, or if the ovaries unexpectedly stop working and you lose all estrogen underneath the birth control pill. So it's confusing area because these tests are often done to look at infertility. And many women, I think, unfortunately, are told to just sit at home and wait for a year of failing to get pregnant with their partner, instead of having these very common, very easy, very inexpensive now tests to look at their reproductive wellness and get care much earlier when it can be most effective. So I think even outside of the sports endocrine arena, it's important from just a general wellness. And I use the example that my daughter got a cholesterol screening when she was 13 for a heart attack that she may or may not have when she's 60 or 70, but there's so many conditions and so much morbidity and mortality actually associated with reproductive disorders that can be identified on a screening checkup.
So we've had a couple people join us late, and we're just now wrapping up and finishing up with our Q&A session. If you have joined us late and have a burning question, please feel free to enter it through the Q&A channel there. It should be an icon at the bottom of your screen. Erin would be more than happy to try to answer them.
And if there's any questions that you have that you don't, feel like sharing in this webinar format, again, feel free to reach out for a one-on-one consultation, a free 15-minute introduction with myself to answer any quick questions and see if it would be a good fit to have you come on as a patient at Pellex Sports.
We do have one that gets at for adult women, Erin. What kind of recommendations for regular monitoring or maintenance do you have for adult women?
It would be similar to teenagers. I think every woman should have a reproductive wellness checkup every year. And by that, I don't mean just like a pap smear and, are you using birth control? I mean, a reproductive endocrinology wellness checkup, again, to look for disorders that may be not always immediately addressed by other providers, because we have medical societies that recommend that we don't screen for things such as premature ovarian insufficiency or PCOS with blood work. But these blood tests, again, are very inexpensive. We screen for many other conditions that have far lower rates of occurring of incidence and prevalence in the community, and they're important to our health, and in my opinion have been underlooked. And we want to diagnose them earlier and help people correct them earlier. So once a year, come in for a reproductive checkup.
So if we don't have any other questions, we want to take the opportunity to thank you again for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We did record the presentation, and so we'll be making it available, live streaming it in a couple of different places. But if you have any other questions or thoughts, obviously share them with Dr. Wolf. Or if you'd like to send them to Body Dynamics, we're happy to share them with her as well.